Iran was not an Axis power. In fact, it went to great lengths to remain neutral during the Second World War. So it's a bit odd then that in 1941, a joint invasion from the British and Soviets put Iran under near-complete occupation. This is the story of the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. Iran, for the first two-thirds of the 20th century, and indeed the previous 2,000 years, was a monarchy. However, it was also a fairly turbulent one, having undergone a coup d'etat in 1921 that eventually saw the previous imperial dynasty replaced with a new, British-backed Shah called Reza Khan. He would be the first of the short-lived Pahlavi dynasty, most famous for his son being overthrown in the 1979 revolution. For now, however, he was simply a new monarch in an underdeveloped country. The new Shah's interest lay largely in modernization, and he set about this task with enthusiasm, opening railroads, including, ironically, the Trans-Iranian Railroad that would cause him issues later, setting up a modern military to replace the tribal militias, and opening universities and public schools. He granted new rights to women and even attempted to secularize the country by reducing the wealth and influence of the clergy. All in all, he was a fairly forward-thinking man. As with most developmental dictators, if you like, his rule was something of a mixed bag. However, he most certainly established Iran as an important transportation hub in the region, with strong connections to the British, who continued to influence the country in its politics. How so, you might ask? The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. In the great British tradition of outsourcing empire building to private companies, British influence in Iran was mostly through their oil interest in the region, which was focused on a single company. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which you would probably know as BP, yes it still exists and yes it's that BP, was a major force in Iranian politics, owning the oil fields in the south of the country. Additionally, when the British realized the importance of oil to their fleet shortly before the First World War, the British government purchased a controlling share of the company, effectively putting Britain in control of Iran's only important export. In 1940, the Abadan refinery alone produced more than 8 million tons of oil for the company, which proved essential for the Royal Navy. I don't want to make this a video on the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, but suffice it to say, the deal between Iran and the British company was not an equitable one, and when the Shah attempted to renegotiate along fairer terms, it served to frustrate the British, who came to believe Iran was seeking an opportunity to seize the oil fields themselves. This wasn't helped by the fact that the Shah was becoming increasingly friendly with Germany, which had become Iran's largest trading partner. He also put several important services under Iranian control, and prevented foreigners from holding certain rights. The reforms he implemented were aimed to give Iran the rights that one would basically expect from a sovereign nation. But one must bear in mind it was the 1930s, and as far as most global powers were concerned, anywhere that wasn't an empire was more or less free real estate with no rights but the ones the empire bestowed on it. Nevertheless, the arrangement worked pretty well for as long as the world was at peace. The new Shah received Western loans to modernize, and the British received Iranian oil to fuel the empire's military and economy. And so long as no major conflict began that would put Britain at risk, the status quo could prevail. The Second World War in Europe began in 1939, for reasons that I assume you already understand, given that you're the audience of this video. So I'm going to ignore it, and instead focus on something much more interesting: logistics. The British Navy required massive amounts of oil, which was being conveniently supplied from Iran, due to Iran's oil being controlled by a British corporation under the control of the British government. Iran, however, was not Britain, and Iran's Shah was barely even fond of Britain by this point. He had in fact spent the last few years building independent Iranian infrastructure separate from that of the UK. Of note, German workers were a hugely important part of this build-up, and by 1941 there were German specialists working throughout the Iranian economy. Due to Iran's importance to the Allied war effort, the idea of a hostile foreign national within shooting distance of essential resources was enough to make the British government fairly uncomfortable. Add to this that the neighbouring Iraqi government was actually overthrown in a pro-Nazi coup in 1941, and you could probably understand why tensions in the region were high, despite Iran's official neutrality. The British invaded Iraq in May 1941, in an Iraq war you've probably never heard of, and restored the pre-coup monarchy, leaving thousands of British troops right on Iran's border. But still this was fine, because the oil continued to flow, and Iran was playing its role effectively, if reluctantly. The final tipping point came in June later that year, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. When the USSR was invaded, the Soviets were still in the process of industrializing. The Germans were also able to quickly overrun many of the Union's largest cities, which left the Red Army in a bit of a pickle. They didn't have much stuff, couldn't produce much stuff, and needed, in layman's terms, a large amount of stuff. As such, the Allies, specifically the United States, ended up providing a significant portion of the Soviet Union's equipment. Getting it to the Soviets was another matter. They could go through the Arctic Circle, which was difficult due to weather and German submarines. Or they could cross through Iran. Iran, which had a freshly built cross-country railway leading right from the coast. The pride and joy of Iran's Shah had just turned the country into a target. This route would become known as the Persian Corridor, and ultimately be how roughly half of the aid given to the Soviet Union, several million tons of equipment, was able to reach the country. Iran, though, was at this point not too keen on the idea of the country being used as a supply route, as it would quite definitively establish them as on the side of the Allies, and only further entrench foreign influence. When the British demanded in August that all German nationals be deported from the country, the Shah refused, and nationalist demonstrators took to the streets of Tehran to protest the British demands. Concerned for their oil, in need of a route to the Soviet Union, and now concerned about a similar pro-Nazi government taking over Iran as it had in Iraq, the British and Soviet Union hastily prepared a regime change. A concept that, as it turns out, was not invented by Dick Cheney in 2003. On the 25th of August 1941, the invasion began. This isn't really a military history channel, so I won't focus too much on the exact strategy or battles, but a bombing campaign began from both the Soviets and British, destroying vital infrastructure, while a naval campaign from the Royal Navy and Royal Australian Navy, go us, took control of the Persian Gulf. The British troops in Iraq fought their way across the border, while the Soviets invaded from the north. The Shah, meanwhile, refused to destroy infrastructure to delay the invasion, and the Iranian army that had been carefully built up over decades found itself nearing complete destruction. The Navy and Air Force were also badly damaged nearly immediately, and despite the Iranian military numbering in the hundreds of thousands, the Shah ordered a ceasefire only 4 days later and entered negotiations. So that was a fairly brief war. Was it incompetence that led to the Iranians' defeat? No, not really. The Iranians actually did pretty well in some places, repelling the invading forces in a few spots, but ultimately there wasn't much of a chance to hold out. The opposing armies were too large with too many tanks and planes compared to the Iranians, who were mostly outdated and on foot. Ultimately, you can't fight two superpowers at once with a half-developed army. On the 17th of September, the Shah abdicated his throne, allowing his son, Crown Prince Mohammed, to take up the position under careful Allied watch. Reza Shah, meanwhile, was placed in Allied custody and initially sent to Mauritius before going to South Africa, where he died only 3 years later in 1944, having never gone home again. Iran would spend the subsequent 4 years under Allied occupation, with the new Shah signing a treaty with the Allies that agreed to Allied occupation, Allied control of the railroad, and the arrest of all Germans, on the condition that the occupation would end 6 months after Germany's defeat. It wasn't a great deal, but under the circumstances, it was about as good as they could hope for. Afterwards, an American was even made Iranian finance minister in an effort to fix a monetary crisis, though this naturally did little to help the impression that Iran had just become an unofficial Western colony. The occupation itself massively destabilized the country, unfortunately, and through a mix of occupation forces needing supplies, infrastructure disruption, mismanagement and appropriations, the country entered a famine in the mid-40s, while inflation jumped as high as 450%. Strangely though, relations did improve somewhat under the new Shah. Iran even went so far as to declare war on Germany in 1943, in exchange for entrance to the United Nations. Later that same year, Tehran would host the Tehran Conference, in which the major Allied nations planned the remainder of the war and its aftermath. So that's just about Iran's involvement in the war. There was, however, one last crisis before the occupation ended and Iran regained independence. Following the war, the Soviet Union, as it so often did, decided they would rather not end the occupation, and in 1946 established 2 independent states in their occupation zone, the Azerbaijan People's Government and the Republic of Mahabad. This one is actually kind of interesting, as it was intended to be a Kurdish state, something that is yet to be achieved even now. Given that blatant violation of the treaty they'd signed in 1941, Iran was able to appeal to the United Nations for support in re-establishing its borders. This was quite literally the first issue the Security Council had to deal with ever. But unlike today, there was some enduring goodwill post-war, and something actually got done. The Soviets eventually agreed to the withdrawal, with the British following suit, and Iran had full control of its borders again. A minor event, but arguably the first crisis of the Cold War, and something I had literally never heard of until I wrote this video. The new Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, would have a tumultuous reign that saw Iran undergo foreign-backed coups, nationalizations, massive social change, and ultimately continuing his father's modernization efforts. Like his father, however, he was also a dictator who increasingly ruled with an iron fist, and he would be eventually overthrown in the 1979 revolution, in which the current Islamic Republic of Iran was established. And that's the story of Iran's involvement in the Second World War. A minor but impactful episode of Middle Eastern history.